Welcome back to the Save the Frogs World Summit 2022 online. I am Save the Frogs founder, Dr. Kerry Kriger. This is a Q&A session. If you have questions, go ahead, send them in. And meanwhile, I'm going to go through questions that came in during the registration process. We had over 350 people register for the event, and many people asked a question about amphibians, and I'm going to go through some of those questions. I've only looked at the first couple questions, so most of these, it's the first time I am seeing the questions. So I'm just going to give you the thoughts off the top of my head. Here we go from Tina Adoglu of the USA. What more can I do in my yard to protect and to help amphibians? All right, a common question. So for all you landowners out there or land managers or people who have the ability to do something good for amphibians on somebody's property, only plant native species. Don't put in any non-native fish either. So stay native, plenty of vegetation. Ideally, if you have some different micro habitats, that's good too. But definitely plenty of vegetation is always a good thing. Build a pond, build a frog pond. If you go to Save the Frogs Academy, savethefrogs.com/academy, we have a wetlands course. Everyone can get 28 days full free access to Save the Frogs Academy at savethefrogs.com/academy-free. Otherwise, become a Save the Frogs member, savethefrogs.com/membership, or apply for a scholarship, savethefrogs.com/scholarship, and you'll get full access to Save the Frogs Academy. Now, within about 3 or 4 days from now, we're going to have 7 new videos all about building a backyard wetland. So definitely check out savethefrogs.com/courses/wetlands. No pesticides or herbicides. Try not to use any bad chemicals. And if there's any pets on the property, don't let them go anywhere near the amphibian habitat. If you have, say, house cats and they're outside, they're probably going to be killing some of your native wildlife because that's what most house cats like to do when they're outside. All right, next question from Laura Honda. Laura, are you out there? Laura was out there before. Laura organized a presentation or two, at least 2 presentations for me at the school she was teaching at in Marin County back in 2014 or so. And she asks, I'd like to know how the frogs are doing around the world. Are their populations continuing to decline, or with people trying to help, are their populations recovering? I think it's all specific to the species and what's going on in that part of the world. If there is a significant effort to protect a species, then a lot of those species are doing well. There's definitely recovery of some species, such as the giant squeaker frog, Arthroleptus crocosua in Ghana, where Save the Frogs has worked for many years. And that frog, at certain times it was thought that there were none of them in Ghana, but as of about 2009, it was thought that there were about 14 total individuals. Now the best estimate is about 200 individuals. And Save the Frogs Ghana has had many years of efforts in the communities where surrounding the rainforest where those frogs live, doing many activities for those frogs and to educate the people. So yeah, we can definitely get frog populations coming back. And we heard earlier from Rob and from Tom and the other speakers about their efforts. And when there are lots of efforts to build wetlands, protect habitat, educate the communities, address the threats, then the amphibians can definitely come back. But there is a huge population of humans on the planet, most of whom don't know or think about amphibians, and a lot of populations are definitely under threat and declining still. All right, Oriane from France, currently in Malaysia, asks, would like to learn more about environmental conservation challenges in Southeast Asia, where I currently live, especially regarding to frogs and other native species. All right, Southeast Asia. So one thing, Southeast Asia probably changes per region, but there's a lot of places where frogs are eaten as food. there is a huge population of humans, very densely concentrated human populations, and that causes habitat destruction, pollution, pesticides, non-native species, lots of problems associated with large human populations. And there's also fewer amphibian conservationists and less awareness in the population, less environmental activity, less a lower number of environmental organizations, probably less effort on behalf of the governments. So you've got this combination of a lot of humans and a low amount of environmental conservation going on. So that's the biggest challenge. I would start by, as with everything that I do to improve the environment, start with environmental education. To me, environmental education is the root of all successful environmental conservation activities. Moving on, Melia Coletta of the USA asks, what are the most interesting research findings of the last decade as it relates to amphibians that the general public should know about? Let's see. I had not thought about that. I don't know if there's anything brand new that we need to know about. Most of the stuff that we need to know to protect them has been known. As in, to me, what are the most important things to know about amphibians? One, that they're on the decline, and two, the reasons for the decline. So the 6 primary threats. I think since those got nailed down 25 years ago, 20 to 30 years ago, that's what we need to know. We need to know, why are they disappearing? Habitat destruction, infectious diseases, in particular chytridiomycosis, invasive species, climate change, overharvesting for the pet and food trades, taking amphibians out of the wild in general, and climate change, drying up certain habitats especially. All right, Jose Pedro Kairos Corre of Singapore, I believe, was on earlier. I work in the herpetology section in a zoo, and I'm very interested in increasing my knowledge in amphibian care and conservation. All right, not necessarily a question, but let's turn it into a question. What can somebody in a zoo do to help out amphibians? So I am about to announce Save the Frogs grant winners. That happens, I believe, tomorrow morning as part of the World Summit, and one of those winners is a zoo in the USA in North Dakota. And zoos can do a lot. Zoos have been doing a lot for amphibians. Not all zoos, but plenty of zoos are active. One thing is that they have access to lots of the public who come interested in wildlife. So there's educating the public through the zoo. Can you get better interactive exhibits going on? Can your zoo financially support amphibian conservation efforts, as many zoos are doing? And then some zoos are actually captive breeding endangered amphibians, ideally with the intent of releasing them at some point into the wild and repopulating those amphibians, the populations, versus simply just showing amphibians to get to, have more ticket sales with no intent of conservation. So I'm not an expert on amphibian rearing in captivity. There are groups that focus specifically on that, and I believe Arturo was talking about food for amphibians. That's going to change per species, but I would definitely get in touch with those groups that know most about amphibians in captivity, and especially people who know about your species of interest. Next question, Thomas Hardy from the USA. Is captive breeding by hobbyists beneficial or detrimental to the overall survival status of individual species of frogs and toads? All right, good question, important question. So let's see, overall survival status is maybe a little bit ambiguous, or maybe it's not. If they're alive in captivity, then they're surviving. So I guess in that respect, yes, hobbyists can keep amphibians alive in captivity. It's a different question, though, and more important to me to ask, to change the question a bit and say, is captive breeding by hobbyists beneficial or detrimental to wild amphibian populations? And for that, I do believe and always have believed that it's detrimental. Now, some people are going to disagree with me. That's fine. A lot of people do disagree with me. Some people will say that by captive breeding them, we are going to educate people about amphibians. And some people do. Some people use their captive amphibians to educate people, and that's good. Now, another thing is, where did the captive species come from? Was it wild caught in a foreign country and exported out of the country illegally? Was it from another captive raised amphibian? So there's a lot of dependent things. Is the person who's holding it educated enough to know not to release it into the wild, where it may spread its disease to native populations or become an invasive species and eat or compete with native species? There's a lot of things going on, but given all the different factors, and that most hobbyists are not connected to an official project aimed at repatriating wild populations. Usually the captive amphibians that hobbyists have are it's just a hobby. It's just for fun. It's just to look at and enjoy. So in that sense, to me, usually they're not contributing much to conservation of wild populations. And based on the number of uneducated people involved who may be purchasing wild-caught amphibians or maybe releasing their amphibians into the wild, or who may have all the best intentions, but they're involved in the unnecessary trade and transport of amphibians and the negative consequences that could go along with that, then I'm not a fan of it. So my suggestion is, my suggestion always has been, don't get an amphibian as a pet. But if you do feel the need to, or the strong, overwhelming desire to, make sure that you educate yourself, put some thought into it, and make sure that you are the most environmentally friendly pet owner that you can be. Another thing I have not discussed at all is the ethics of holding amphibians in captivity. I won't go into that unless a question comes up, but I'll let that sit in your brain for something for you to think about. Next question, Ryan Smith, Costa Rica. How is climate change and global warming affecting amphibian populations? What can we do to save the frogs? All right, so Ryan is from, or is in, Costa Rica. Costa Rica is a famous place, maybe the most famous place related to climate change and amphibians, and that is based on probably research of Alan Pounds from 1996 or so that concluded it was climate change that drove the golden toad Bufo peregrinis to extinction. I don't agree that that was the reason for its extinction, but we will never know for certain because its extinction happened in the late 1980s. But nonetheless, Costa Rica is at risk of climate change, in particular because of the number of cloud forests. When the temperature rises, the clouds tend to move up the mountain. When the clouds move up the mountain, what's remaining below dries up. And a lot of those amphibians are dependent on wet land, moist leaf litter to put their eggs in. They may be terrestrial breeders. They don't go to the ponds. They don't go to the rivers. They just need wet land. And when the cloud levels rise, then they have less total area to live on. Also, if you're at the top of a mountain and things heat up, you cannot go any higher up that mountain to cool off. In other parts of the world, if there are persistent droughts, as there are, we heard from Rob earlier about California's droughts. If there's drought year after year, then that can definitely impact amphibian populations given their need for water. Next question, and if you have a question, go ahead, chat it in. Kim Winter of the USA asks, how do we engage people who know nothing about nor show any interest in amphibians. All right, how do we engage them? Well, say, start out by engaging the people who do have an interest or are more open-minded. Maybe they don't know anything or they don't know much about amphibians, but they're environmentally minded. They like wildlife. They like nature. They like the thought of saving the planet and its wildlife and humans. Those are good people to start out with. So you may as well go to them. And while you may say, hey, I'm preaching to the choir, maybe, but you can get those people more active. All of you probably know something about frogs if you're here. You probably like frogs already, but you can learn more. You can get more educated. You can get more inspired. You can get more knowledgeable in how to save amphibians. So that's where I would start. But as far as the people who maybe don't care about amphibians, you could put some cool frog photos in front of them, because most people do like how frogs look, even if they haven't thought about frogs. I'm looking right here at this one cover, the profile picture that Elmer has up. That's a pretty cool looking frog right there. Maybe a Rhaccophorus, I'm not sure what it is. But give them some cool videos, frog photos. Engage them in a fun, happy, enlightening way, and maybe they will change. And if you can get them outside, maybe not in the pouring rain, though, hey, maybe they'd like that too. That would really be the experience. But getting people outside to show them wild frogs in their native habitats is always a good thing. And there are certain parts of the world where you can make a strong connection between amphibians and human health. I think of West Africa and malaria, and that the people, they've got lots of other problems going on to think about aside from amphibians. But if you can connect those amphibians to mosquito populations and malaria and dengue fever and diseases that they don't want, then they're going to listen up. All right, next question comes from Rob, who was speaking earlier. How do HCPs work, habitat conservation plans? And I forward this to my go-to expert on HCPs, Chris Berry. And I said, hey, Chris, do you want to provide a paragraph? And he said, just show up for my talk. So everyone, if you want to learn about habitat conservation plans, Chris will be speaking in the morning, we'll say 14 hours from now or so. Chris Berry will be discussing habitat conservation plans in detail, so show up for that. And especially if you're interested in learning how governments can and do help amphibians, I would definitely be here for that. Next question, Amara Sen of the USA. I've noticed that frogs have completely disappeared from my natural environment. Is there any way to bring them back? Okay, so I assume that means that wherever you used to see or hear frogs, they're not there anymore, or they're not noticeable there anymore. Now, one thing is that amphibian populations can change dramatically year to year based on climatic conditions at the time and in preceding years. So just because you don't hear many amphibians one year, it does not mean that they're gone. They may be back the next year in full force. So that's definitely something to keep in mind. Is there a way to bring them back? The best thing that you can do is make sure that there is suitable habitat, and if you can identify any of the threats to those amphibians, try to remove them or lessen them so that the amphibians do have a place to return. All right, if we think about El Valle, Panama, amphibians, many of them disappeared. Some went completely extinct, extirpated from chytrid fungus 25 years ago or so, and there are significant efforts to breed the species to give them a chance at surviving out in the wild again. But there's lots of new problems for those frogs, specifically with habitat destruction in that area, which is not that far from Panama City, a large city. So we do always need to make sure that even if the amphibians appear to have decreased in population size, that we're making that habitat ready for them should one hop on through and we want to make sure that there's a good place and that that frog likes it there, starts to call, and that other frogs in the distance hear that frog calling and come back, and some of them hopefully will breed and grow the population. Next question, Yves Schulten of Canada. What are the most effective and necessary field survey methods for consultants working for developers to detect and inventory amphibians going beyond anure and call counts for the purpose of finding and conserving good habitat in the development planning process? All right, so field survey methods. If you are a consultant working for a developer, then I think your number one goal is to correctly determine the presence or absence of species at the site. And for that, the number one thing I think of is Ron Hayer's book from 1995 called Amphibian Monitoring Techniques. I probably have the name slightly incorrect, but Ron Heyer, Heyer. I'm pretty sure the book was published in 1995. And that's definitely been the go-to book for me. I can't imagine that much changing from it. So you've got visual encounter surveys, you've got audio surveys, listening. That could be in person, it could be call recorders that are sitting out there, pit traps, buckets put into the ground, checked at least twice a day so that anything that falls into that bucket does not desiccate or get eaten, or a much less chance of that if you're checking them regularly. And then I'll say maybe the new thing that's come up since then would be environmental DNA, eDNA techniques. I'm definitely not an expert on that, but that is certainly another possibility. All right, Elmer says, I feel there's an association between the perils threatening frogs and those threatening democracy today. So, of course, there's lots of things threatening frogs and democracy today. One of those things, war, will be discussed in a few hours. Dr. Krishan Kumar Sharma will be discussing the effect of war on biodiversity. So show up for that. Next question. Donna Hrinnick, USA, says, I'm a special education teacher, and my students love all the different species of frogs. That's good. They would like to know why they are so different and how does it help them in their habitat. Good question. So that comes straight back to one of my favorite books of all time, Charles Darwin, on the origin of species. I don't think you're ever going to get a better explanation than by reading the book, of which I found in my life that most biologists, even professional biologists, PhD students, master's students, undergraduates, and beyond have never read the book. You got to read the book. Now, I don't know if the book's even allowed in your school. I don't know with all the book banning going on, but that's got the best explanation of why species evolve, how they evolve, why they become adapted. There's the answer to your question. They're going to adapt to their surroundings to ensure their survival and the survival of their offspring. And given the huge number of habitats and biotic and abiotic factors, things such as climate, other species in the area, amphibians and other species develop in different ways to ensure or to increase the likelihood of their survival. On top of that, I'll say that the book is one of the best books on natural history ever written, even if you remove all the stuff about evolution. Just the natural history is excellent. And then if you read the final paragraph of just about every chapter in there, it usually has some deep philosophical thoughts that give you plenty to think about. Shen Tan from Singapore. How will amphibian decline affect the world? Also, is the dissection of frogs detrimental to the environment? It is running experiments on amphibians like scientists and stuff considered animal testing. Okay, let's see. What do we consider animal testing? I guess if you've got a live animal there and you're doing stuff to it or with it, then it's probably animal testing. So I think the key for scientists, we'll get to dissection after this, but for scientists is you always have to think, ideally, remove yourself from the culture. Remove yourself as much as possible from the culture that surrounds you, namely your lab, your professor, your colleagues, co-workers, your co-authors, and ask yourself, is the research or the testing or the investigation that I'm doing with the amphibians worth it in the end? Will it do more good for amphibians than harm? That's what you have to ask. And why do I say you got to remove yourself from the situation? Because certainly if let's just take a PhD student. Their professor wants them to do something. This is the way it's done. This is the way it's always been done. This is all you've been hearing them say for years. And your professor comes from a different era than you, and things change. So just make sure you are good ethically with what you're doing. All right, is the dissection of frogs detrimental to the environment? I'll say that the removal of the frog from the wild in order to dissect it is detrimental to the environment. Krishan Kumar Sharma, who will be speaking in a few hours, was and is one of perhaps the main reason that the entire country of India stopped dissecting frogs at the university and college level. And that, I'm sure, has saved many millions of amphibians. I'm going to call that the end of my Q&A. There's tons more questions. Let me just see what's going on here. We got to question number 13. And how many good questions? We've got 92 questions labeled as good questions. How'd they get labeled? These are all the incoming questions, and that's from Save the Frogs volunteer Sophie Bennett. Took the time to go through all these questions and make it easy for me to pick out the ones to answer. Or I haven't picked them. I'm just randomly going through them. I haven't seen the vast majority of these questions before. All right, thanks for being here. I am Save the Frogs founder, Dr. Kerry Kriger. This has been a Q&A. We will try to do some more Q&A later.